First, I'd like to introduce Venkatesh Rao, founder of Ribbon Farm. So it's all to you.
All right. How's everybody doing? Looks like a lot of people are still trickling in. Well, welcome to the AI Demystified panel. My name is Venkatesh Rao, and I run a blog called ribbonfarm.com and another one called breakingsmart.com. Both are like technology and culture blogs. And my background is in engineering, but I've since become, well, mystified by technology, so I'm a good person to be moderating this panel. I'll play the role of the mystified person, and our friends here are going to demystify AI for us. Let's do some introductions here. So Richard is the chief scientist for Salesforce, leading the AI work here, and you were acquired with the company you founded, MetaMind. And how long have you been with Salesforce now?
Since April last year.
Since April last year. So everybody's kind of heard of your resume. Can you tell us a little bit about what got you into AI initially and what first got you excited, whether it was in high school or whenever?
So in high school, I've always been excited about math and languages. So when you think about trying to combine something that's very abstract and should be true in 1,000 years from now with something where any teenager can just invent a new word like YOLO, and now it has to adapt, which is language. The best place to do that was computer science. And then inside computer science, once I took my first sort of machine learning statistics class in 2006, I thought this is the future. Once you're really good in machine learning and AI, you can apply it to all other things out there, language, vision, genetics, everything. And so it just kept on going from there.
Awesome. And now here you are leading AI for Salesforce. Nicola. So Nicola is the global managing director at Accenture for AI, and I think that's a kind of role that has never existed in the past. It's a new kind of role. So, Nicola, tell us how you got into AI and what first you got interested in the topic.
I've always been a sci-fi, huge fan. So, starting from 2001: Space Odyssey, that was my first encounter with AI. And then, more seriously, I did economics in university, and as part of my PhD thesis, I did studies on neural networks, machine learning at that time, very, very early. And then I kind of fell into the AI winter, so I hibernate through it. And then, 3 years ago, because in Accenture we've been always, we have an R&D function within the company, so we've been doing quite a bit of AI, but very much limited to specific areas of the business, not with the broad diffusion of opportunities that there is right now. And so then I get engaged again, and now I'm very happy because I think I have one of the best jobs out there, which is leading this new capability that we built a year ago.
Awesome. And our final panelist, Tara Lyons. She was the policy advisor for AI at the Obama White House and is currently a Mozilla fellow and is taking a sabbatical and doing lots of other things. So Tara, tell us how you first got into AI.
Yeah, I came to tech policy actually originally because I was affiliated with Harvard University at the time, working in Cape Town, South Africa on a drone project. And we ran into a ton of regulatory impediments, and so I necessarily had to become basically a public policy expert in order to implement the technology we were developing, and found myself working on robotics policy at the White House. So about a year and a half ago, towards the last year of the Obama administration, we got a mandate from the president to start caring about AI explicitly, and so we ran this massive policy initiative, and I've cared deeply about AI governance ever since.
Awesome. So we've got 3 great panelists here, and just a procedural note. We have about an hour, and we will open up for questions in the last 10, 15 minutes or so. So if you have any questions, you'll get a chance to ask them in the end. But let's get started. We have a bunch of interesting themes to cover. So Richard, I want to start with you, since this is a developers conference. Let's start with sort of the developer's perspective, which is sort of, could you bound the playground for us? Like, where is AI? Where does regular software development stop and statistics in the traditional sense stop? And where does AI begin?
It's an interesting question. I think if anything, that actually shifts. So maybe 5 years ago, it would have required a lot of AI research to put together a very well-optimized and well-regularized recurrent neural network for text classification. There was no TensorFlow yet. There are no developer tools really. When I started with deep learning, I just multiplied matrices manually and then derived the gradients and had to do all of that work manually. Now you can actually literally, since yesterday, even inside Salesforce, we announced the sentiment API and an intent classification API where text comes in and you can immediately classify, is this email a support question, billing question, service question, or sales, somebody from sales should follow up with it. So now it is literally just an API call. And so I think as we make more and more progress in AI, you will see that shift from research into production. And if anything, that shift is happening really, really quickly now. We have some examples where we have research papers that we publish, and then literally 3 months later, another large company talks about that algorithm in their production system. So I think it's a really exciting time for developers because they're getting access to these really sophisticated algorithms in higher and higher levels of abstraction.
So Nicola and Tara, starting with you, Nicola. So in terms of how so this is the developer's view of how the science is evolving and things start out as an AI hard problem and then turn into an easy API call, like you said, Richard. So from the business perspective, how do you think about what are the problems where AI is suitable versus AI is not an appropriate tool, or how do you frame that question?
So I think there are two. If you look at the evolution of the technology, we're just seeing the beginning of it, right? But so I think 5, 6 years, considering all the amount of focus, resources, and talent, and money that is going into this sector, we'll see even much more in terms of possibilities, right? But if you think about today, what the technology can do, I think the two largest areas of applicability are around voice and general interaction with machines, right? So just to give you an example, we're working pretty much with all the leading telcos on the planet to redo the way customer service is managed, right? So, but not only, how do I do the next generation IVR, but much more about, how do I engage with the customer in a different way? From the time that you are, in an omni-channel type of communication with the enterprise down to the in-store experience, for example, right? So that's a very transformative approach that AI is going to bring together. And then the other area where I think it's just the tiny beginning of it, but it's the way how we're going to re-engineer the business processes of the enterprise. So if you think about the great majority of the systems that we use in large enterprises today are very deterministic, right? So there is someone that writes a rule, and the rule gets coded into a system, and then it's executed. And I think what's going to happen is going to be very different, right? We're going to build the boundaries, right? We're going to express at high level what the requirements for that business processes are, but then we will let the machine decide which one is the best path to take to optimize that particular process. And that area, I think, is where the big, payback for AI is going to be. So to synthesize a little bit, right? So a lot of interaction, machine, human machine. So voice is a big one. Vision, I think, is another huge one that is starting. But then we're going to see this fundamental change in the way business processes are designed and executed in enterprises that I think is going to be revolutionary.
So you said an interesting thing there where business processes kind of shift from deterministic to more sort of a probabilistic way the technology operates. So that sort of suggests a very difficult challenge for people in policy, right? I mean, when you think about regulating AI and you want to know what the algorithm was thinking when it decided to do something, policymaking is a very deterministic kind of mindset, right? So how do you grapple with the nature of AI as a fundamentally probabilistic thing?
Yeah, it's a really fundamental question. I mean, policymaking in general is extremely inflexible. I mean, when you think about a regulation, you have a body of text that codifies a rule around a particular technology suite, as one example, and adjusting that can take multiple years, if not more than that. at any given point in time, no matter who is in charge of the governance system, just by virtue of the process involved. So it's a really challenging thing to try to govern technology that is so fast moving as AI and so flexible in terms of how it's defined and what it's applied to. And that's something we really struggled with in the last administration in doing a survey of the field and trying to figure out where it's appropriate for government to take action, where the ecosystem needed to be given free rein to develop, and innovators to figure out what needed to be done and how it should be done before the government steps in and impedes that process. And there are fairly obvious examples, one of them being where AI meets the physical world in the form of robotics, and we've seen recent legislation on that and policymaking in the realm of automated vehicles. So the last administration instituted a policy regime on self-driving vehicles through the Department of Transportation. We also did something similar with unmanned aircraft systems, which haven't quite reached AI in the sense that we're talking about on the stage right now, because the government doesn't let anyone not fly their own drone. So you can't actually have an autonomous vehicle in that sense. But when you're talking about purely computational systems, it's a real challenge for regulators to grapple with what exactly that means in the wild and how they institute rules around how those things should operate. So.
Mm-hmm. And it's also an interesting challenge actually for developers and UI UX folks. How do you present the outcome of some AI algorithm to your users and even administrators as you set up workflows and so on? Because sometimes, in most cases, it's not, if you had 100% accuracy, it would be a deterministic rule. Mm-hmm. You can hope for at most like 95% accuracy for many cases. And you really have to think about your AI application and how users will actually interact with it. So there's some examples where maybe it's okay if you have high precision but low recall. So in search, for instance, it's okay if out of the 1,000 search results, 900 are wrong, as long as the first 10 are correct. Mm-hmm. Right? And so there you're okay with having low precision overall, but you want to have high recall in that first couple of examples. And there are other ones, like self-driving cars are the worst regime, because you need high precision and high recall, and that's why it's going to take them a long time to really get fully autonomous cars in all kinds of scenarios and weathers and weather conditions and so on working. And so you have to carefully think about that. And if you realize that you're not yet at a human level of performance, then you need to, it can still be actually useful. So for instance, machine translation systems right now are nowhere near the quality of human translators. However, the best human translators now use a raw translation from a machine translation system, and then they just kind of fix it up. And that's exactly the kind of interaction where people get enhanced, human translators get much faster, even though the AI isn't yet at a perfect level.
That's, you bring up an interesting point about how interaction design changes when AI becomes sort of a part of all kinds of software. So there's a developer conference, but can I get a quick straw poll here? Are there any interaction designers in the audience? UI, UX, raise your hand. See a couple? Raise your hand if you're a developer. All right, so a lot more developers than interaction designers. But even though they're not in the room, I believe they should be, right? I mean, there's so much that has been written and said about developers. What changes in interaction paradigms? I mean, we've seen early things like Siri and Alexa, things like that. But how does interaction change? And developers need to know this as well when AIs sort of power everything.
I mean, so the examples I just gave are good examples for that. You really need to carefully think about how your algorithms integrate into the workflow, and then also how your workflow might generate more and better data. Okay. And then how your algorithms might change or become deprecated over time. There's actually a lot of complexity in running machine learning algorithms in production systems over a long time. Let's say one of the features we've released is lead and opportunity scoring. So any salesperson could reach out to thousands of people on any given day, and this leads and opportunity scoring is basically a new column in their table that allows them to say, all right, today, based on all the email interactions and a bunch of other features, today these 10 people are the most likely to actually want to get your call or your email. Now, if you train that only once, and then you introduce a new product and a new SKU, and the world changes, then if you don't retrain that algorithm frequently, eventually it will give you bad predictions. And so developers have to think about those kinds of workflows and how they're integrating AI. And then hopefully we'll also work with UI UX people to actually infuse the AI outcomes and predictions in the right places at the right times.
Just to add, from developers' impact, right? So we do a lot of development work, and we're introducing AI, throughout the workflow, as Richard was saying earlier. What we're seeing is that, first of all, AI it's not ready. It's kind of the centaur type of approach, right? So like the human translator that is not going to get replaced. But the technology can help, do the dirty work, and so the human can get engaged, to write a better translation, right, from a syntactic perspective, etc., semantics, and so on. And I think it's happening exactly the same thing in development, right? So, for example, we're doing, for us, almost 90% of all the testing. So I don't know if you guys like to do testing, but when I was doing development, that was something I really hated. And then, most of that testing now is performed by the machine. So it's a great thing, right? So you can produce much more. You can analyze code much faster. You can have suggestions, right? But again, there is not yet a machine that can code better than a human developer.
So let's get back to that question when we talk about employees and productivity.
Yeah.
But let's switch gears to sort of the macro level of the same employee question of what happens to the workforce at large when there's AI systems mature and pervade all technology systems. So you wrote a couple of reports in the Obama administration about workforce impact, and you examined how big technology changes in the 19th century and earlier in the 20th century had workforce impacts and what happened. So how is AI going to impact the workforce, employment? What's the same as the 19th century? What's different?
I wish I could answer that question. I mean, I think that's the million-dollar question right now for so many economists and developers. In the last administration, we spent a lot of time thinking about questions related to what the sort of macro scale impacts of AI-based automation would be on the U.S. economy and workforce, because that's a central question for a lot of people in this new technology revolution. Where will jobs be lost and when, by which types of people, and how do we get in front of that from a policy intervention standpoint? Not surprisingly, we could not really come to any stiff conclusions about any of those questions. But we did think that AI will continue to increase wealth, and along with it, probably productivity. The position we took in the last administration, and I personally agree with this, is that we need vastly more AI and not less of it in order to make sure that we're doing this in a healthful manner. And to continue investing in research and development, both privately and from a public standpoint, in order to make sure that the impacts of AI are broadly shared as well. So wealth inequality is a big topic of conversation when you think about the job displacement questions, but it also gets to more, I think, what are more interesting questions about how it will revolutionize individual institutions in terms of the workforce that they establish and sustain, and the tasks that they're able to automate, and the productivity that they're able to allow their workforce because of the automatability of what previously were just sort of rote tasks. So we looked a lot at that question as well, but there's a lot of uncertainty in this realm, and I think the best answer to give here is just that we need to keep doing what we're doing as developers and engineers and as institutions to try to make the impacts of AI felt as widely as possible by as many people.
So we published two studies, right? One on macroeconomic impact of AI. That was published in the fall of last year, and the other one just last week on the microeconomic impact. So what's the impact on companies, right, of the adoption of AI? And they're both coming to the same conclusion, that is actually a really good thing because it increases productivity. And just to give you some examples, in Accenture, internally, okay, so I'm not talking about work we're doing with clients, but last year we reshaped 25,000 positions inside the firm, and we ended up increasing headcount significantly. So that shows that if we do things in a more efficient way, we'll drive more work for everybody. So who knows in 5, 10 years what's going to happen? I agree completely, right? There is so many unknowns, and is the technology really going to deliver on those promises of general intelligence and stuff like that? But I think if you look at some of the physical data that we're seeing in the marketplace right now, they're actually going in the direction that it increases the level of productivity impact, positive impact on GDP, etc.
And
think-
yeah, go ahead.
I think it's important to acknowledge that the answer is actually very different depending on which industry you're in. I think if you're in manufacturing and transportation, I think there will be fewer jobs, and it's hard to argue against that when you have self-driving trucks, when you figure out more things in robotics and things like that in manufacturing. I think that will be a big change in jobs. But then as you move, for instance, closer to CRM, it's actually, again, a very complex story. So in sales, if you make every salesperson in your organization 30% more efficient, no organization will say, oh, well, then let's fire 30% of our salespeople so we go back to the original sales productivity, right? No, they'll just be happy they're selling more and maybe even get more salespeople in. On service, it can, in some cases, be a cost-cutting measure. If you can automate 30% of service requests with AI automatically, then maybe you don't need 30%. Maybe, and this is something you actually told me before, sometimes people realize, well, if the service works more fluently and very efficiently and people come out happier afterwards, then you can actually retrain those service people as salespeople and then do up and cross-selling after you've done something. So, but it is a question. And then in marketing, one example I like to bring is in getting people some humility who think they know exactly what will happen in the future. Imagine DARPA, in the first DARPANet and ARPANET between different universities is just coming out. The first TCP/IP packages were sent, and people are like, what's the impact on jobs? Nobody in their right mind would have estimated that a couple decades later there will be a social media marketing manager job title. It's just nobody could have guessed that in their right mind. And so likewise now, people ask what new jobs will be there, and I don't always have the answer, but it's obvious to me that human ingenuity and creativity will prevail, and people will find interesting new things to do. And in marketing, for instance, new jobs will be created. If you understand that you can now go through all images on Twitter with an algorithm, and then also go through every time your product was mentioned or shown in a picture, combine that with sentiment, and then devise very personalized marketing campaigns with the help of AI inputs, then that is, and maybe even have the AI help you with creating new outputs, that will be a new kind of job. So, even just at sales,
Let's
service, and
talk a
marketing,
little bit about the
different
kinds of
aspects.
jobs at a macro level. Tara, perhaps you can speak to that since you brought up inequality. So going by previous tech revolutions like the 1970s industrial automation revolution, you saw a lot of higher paid, higher skilled manufacturing jobs go away, but the jobs didn't go away forever. New jobs came up, but the new jobs were in the service sector, right, and generally lower skilled. Is there something fundamentally different about AI and the way humans plus AI interact where that dynamic might not happen this time, where the jobs that replace the jobs that go away are maybe more creative, more fun, or something like that?
Yeah, you're asking me all the hard questions, all the unanswerable ones. I wish I knew the answer, but I think there's a lot more nuance to the debate than a lot of what has been reflected in the popular media, for instance. So, on the one hand, 2 to 3 million truck driving jobs in the next 10 years. Are very likely to be displaced because of self-driving cars and automatability around that industry. But there are jobs that will probably come to the forefront that we can't even, to Richard's point, anticipate at this moment as a result of that, a direct result of that, and the transformations happening in that industry. And then, you also can't be categorical about applying this across demographic lines or even sectors of the economy or even types of jobs by wage. And a good example of that I like to give, which is classic, which is the sort of truck driving and housekeeping example. So people who clean houses are in basically the same wage bracket as people who drive vehicles. And one of those jobs will be automated. as I mentioned before, but housekeeping is an extremely challenging job to automate because we just don't have the sophistication of robots and machine intelligence that we need to have a robot know that whatever's on your floor isn't trash instead of your belongings and to put them in its correct place. So I don't think we have to worry anytime soon about those positions being automated out of the market. So you can't even paint things with as broad a stroke as by wage or economic sector. And then I think in certain sectors we'll also see transformations happening that are not easily able to be anticipated. And another example of that is in what's happening in the financial services sector. Goldman Sachs spent the last 3 years or so trying to figure out how best to automate the steps that need to be taken in order to IPO a company. They actually identified 147 some odd steps, and they've been able to automate half of those so far. And surprisingly, they haven't fired a single person as a result of that. Instead, they are taking entry-level classes of bankers. It's known to be a really hard job, 18-hour average work day, and they're increasing the productivity of those classes of people, preventing them from leaving and going to private equity, which usually happens after 1 to 3 years, and giving them more satisfying work to do. And so as a result, their whole firm has been lifted from a productivity standpoint. And I think we'll see those sort of nuanced adjustments start happening in different places and potentially unexpected places as AI reaches us in sophisticated ways that we just didn't really understand previously.
So we published, like, on then I agree completely. So we published last week, like with MIT Sloan Institute, a study, and we think that there are at least so far, three main categories of new jobs that are created. Because if you think about AI as an entity, right, that is acting inside the organization, and then we call them, maybe it's a simplified way, the trainers, the explainers, and the sustainers, right? So the trainers is because there is a new generation of people that need to know, what is the right data set, right? What are the objectives that I want to achieve from a business perspective, et cetera. So you cannot just unleash an AI on data and pretend that you have a business outcome. The explainers are the people that are going there and can represent the will or the decisions of the AI to the rest of the stakeholders. It's really important. Sometimes these systems are black boxes, right? And then the sustainers, because think about it, it's almost like a living organism, right? So you cannot just send it out there in the wild and then forget about it, right? You have to constantly manage it, govern it, right? Making sure that the decisions don't have bias, that are matching the ethical and the culture of the organization as well, right? So I know it's super simplified, but it gives an example of the fact that we are introducing something new. And when you're introducing something new, it's not something that is going to replace, but it's going to add, right? So as you add, you need to have the human infrastructure around it to making sure that it's not doing something wrong first, right? And then second, that it's delivering the value that it's supposed to deliver.
So can you connect that to what you said earlier about the Centaur model of human plus computer interaction, right? So for those of you who are not familiar, there's a sport called Centaur chess where a human player teams up with a machine and they compete against each other. So human-machine chess teams competing against each other. So that's fun. Self-driving trucks are fun, but these are kind of like, I don't know, sensational examples. Can you sort of talk about Centaurs and business processes?
Perfect. There are two examples. There is a gigantic business for us right now, which is one is what I was saying, like customer interaction, right? And so in the B2C world, right? So the fact that you don't want to wait like 15 minutes on the phone to get someone to pick it up and just tell the company that you're changing address, so you want to pay your bill, right? So these things you can do in a very easy way with the machine. But when the interaction becomes more complicated, right? Then the human takes over that communication, right? So it's kind of so you have humans that on the company side that are happier because they do higher end jobs. They're not just changing address in a system, right? And also for us, from a consumer perspective, the interaction is much faster. Another example is, and if you move this again, the customer service story into the more complex customer service, which is in the B2B world where you actually have to solve a problem, the fact that the machine can pre-compile a lot of answers for you and you pick one answer from there, it's huge for everybody, right? It doesn't mean that you need to replace the human. And then there are lots of other examples around, right? For example, one of the biggest problems the banks have is around compliance, is they get a lot of false positives. So there are like people, right? They get, I get stopped. I use my credit card all the time because I'm using it on a different website, right? So there must be some way that you can use that intelligence to do a better service for me and also for the bank in that particular case, right?
So you're bringing up, I guess, an interesting question of two variables, just productivity, where the customer experience or something like that, you have a mix of human and machine that creates leveraged productivity. But there's also this quality of experience aspect, right? I mean, we're all familiar with terrible telephone systems where we have like 6 layers of horrible algorithmic trees to walk through, and then maybe we get through to a human. How does AI change that customer experience from like, okay, it might be equally productive, but can you actually make the customer experience go from annoying as hell to somewhat enjoyable? So what does AI do there?
I mean, I think if anything, it will help because instead of having to go through a long tree and typing a bunch of buttons, you can just say what you want to do and have a one-step interaction with the AI. So I think you'll have more personalization and much more efficiency in getting to your answers more quickly in the case of service.
So do we have any early examples of sort of AIs transforming the customer experience from frustrating to, I don't know, customer delight or something like that?
So we just released some of our intent classification at this conference, so we don't have any like long-term stories yet.
Okay. So let's see. We've kind of covered a bunch of the themes we wanted to touch upon. And one of the themes that sort of cuts across all of them is the ethics of AI, right? It cuts across customer experience, employee, macro, micro. So yeah, how should we even think about ethics, or is that even worth thinking about and the technology will do what it wants?
I mean, I think this is one of the central questions for the immediate term in this field. How do we develop AI responsibly and deploy it in ways, again, that allow for its growth to be maximally shared? And from a public policy standpoint, which is obviously what my background is in, we thought in the course of developing the AI initiative in the Obama administration that this is probably one of the things that needs to be paid attention to most. And I think, honestly, this conversation really starts with diversity and inclusion in the field, making sure that as many people are represented in the development of AI as possible is really important, because we've seen examples in the past where, when the developer pool is constrained to a certain type of person, you're not thinking about the needs of your customers across all demographics and all types of users, which is harmful from a business perspective, but it's also harmful equally from a social and a societal perspective as well. And certainly when you apply algorithms to decision-making capacity in the sense that it affects people's lives, like in determining loans or financial decisions, in pre-sentence bail decisions, which we've seen recent press on, or in other sort of criminal justice contexts, it can be an even bigger deal than it would be otherwise. So, I think paying attention to this issue is really critical for firms thinking about this, and individuals, to be sure, and also just making sure that we're encouraging as many people to be a part of this conversation as possible. So aside from the technical aspects of development, ensuring that the discussion is multidisciplinary and as holistic as possible, ensuring that people from all types of different backgrounds, whether sociological or ethical or philosophical or technical, are involving themselves in deep discussions about how how we create a world where AI is properly affecting people, increasing productivity, but in a way that is ethically sound and also socially positive, I think is really important.
So if I might summarize, so you're talking mainly about when AIs are making decisions about humans and the AIs are being trained by the experiences of humans, all the biases get inherited. Right. That's one thing to mitigate. The sort of trade-off there is with privacy and data, right? Mm-hmm. So the AIs need to know a lot about the people and systems they're making decisions about. So how do you think about privacy in the context of the fact that, I think Mark Benioff said this in one of his op-eds, where AIs need a lot of data to, well, either be ethical or unethical. So how do you deal with privacy there?
Maybe just a second on the ethics. I think it is something that's really important, and you can kind of boil down to diversity both in the workforce and in the data sets that you have. And the problem is that sometimes, and this is actually something that might be relevant even for our developers here, as we will empower you to create your own classifiers and your own AI algorithms, you really have to carefully think about the data sets that came in. And also hiring is a big part. You don't want to sometimes just take historical data, because historical data may have had negative biases. And it's actually non-trivial in how you will fix that afterwards. Maybe you can add some bias terms or something manually at the very end, or create certain rules depending on like ethical standards. So in order to think through this, we actually joined also the partnership on AI with a lot of other companies to try to have the most positive impact with them. Now, in terms of privacy, there's a lot of complexity there as well. And as you deploy, you have to carefully think about simple things like permissions, which sometimes you may have a field that you as a developer or a certain person in your organization doesn't have access to. But that field would clearly help with the predictive power of the algorithm. So there's a lot of complexity inside an organization. And then there's complexity across organizations. Our default, trust is our number one value at Salesforce. And our default is no data sets from one organization will influence another organization, right? And so, but eventually, I think there will be examples where it's actually useful to have a global model where everybody benefits if they all share their data in some way. And so that is a big shift in the thinking that organizations will have to make. A simple example would be social media sentiment. We all just benefit if we have a more accurate sentiment classification algorithm on top of social media, like tweets and so on. Now, that is rarely the core competency of a company, so more companies might be willing to share their data in that kind of realm.
I think it's a matter of the trade-off, I think, as Richard was saying, right? So if you ask me, 10 years ago, we are in the 10 years anniversary of the iPhone, right? And says, would you like that someone knows everything that, you're doing, right? Like from who you're paying, who you're talking to, where you are, etc. What you like, you don't like. I would say 10 years ago, I would have said not at all, right? But now we give it for granted. Why? Because we're getting a lot in exchange. Right? We can argue in the long run, is it a really good thing? I don't know. But I think we're getting something in exchange. And I think from an enterprise perspective, we're gonna see exactly the same thing, right? So yes, in principle, I don't want to share my data, but if there is value in putting all the data in a global pool of data and I get something better for me as well, I think enterprises will follow exactly the same pattern as us consumers.
So what you're saying suggests that there's some sort of Overton window effect in, I guess, if you're familiar with Overton window, it's like the zone of acceptable things starts to shift, right? So people are uncomfortable sharing data 10 years ago, and now they are. So in politics, it's similar. Certain issues, like gay rights were like you couldn't talk about them 15 years ago, and now you can, and now it's suddenly mainstream politics. So there's the shift in sort of how people think about AI ethics. Is there also sort of an evolution in, say, corporate governance policies, how people think about that? So how is that evolving?
I just want to highlight the point that Tara made earlier, which I think is fantastic, is that big believer of that as well. So I don't think there is, and it never happened in the history of mankind, right? That we can say these are the ethical standards that everybody should adhere to, right? Even today, right? Like in a culture in China, it's difficult ethical standards than it is here, and it is in Europe, and I'm Italian, and it's different within Europe in Italy, right? So I don't think we can absolutely define those criteria. But what the companies need to do is to have that approach of, first of all, be aware that this could be a problem. So have the discussion. It's not going to get away the problem if you don't think about it, right? It will get actually much worse. And there are lots of examples, from big tech companies who fell in that trap, and they created things that were horribly biases. But why? Because there was not enough diversity in the teams that built them to really ask the question, is it going to work that way or not, right? I think it really is what companies should do, right? Is to create these teams that are multidisciplinary, I'm a big believer that, for example, we are at the verge of the rebirth of the liberal arts, right? So you need to have someone that is more sensitive and, is literary background versus necessarily, all engineers, right? That we do have in companies right now. So I think that kind of diversity, openness, it's really critical. And I think there is an enormous demand from enterprises, at least to us, to understand how they can set that up inside their own companies, right? Like last week we said that, by 20, I don't remember the exact day, but 2028, I think, we want to have, 50% of our workforce to be women, right? So it's a big goal, but it's an acknowledgement that the diversity and that approach is what is needed versus trying to say, okay, this is how ethics should work. I think it's not going to work in the long term.
I think
so.
I'm sorry.
Go ahead.
I think the transparency question is key as well. I think having a public conversation about this is going to be one of the most important factors, ensuring that the public becomes comfortable at a societal scale with whether it's giving data in the context of data privacy issues or in just becoming consumers of this technology. The partnership on AI, which Richard cited before, is a great example of an endeavor of a large number of companies from across sectors, academic institutions, and nonprofit organizations all banding together, willing to basically say, we want to have a public conversation about these issues. And we think it's important to acknowledge vulnerability, the fact that we don't have all the answers, and the fact that we are seeking them with the public's input as a community. And one of the things I hear most from, this is a very sophisticated audience, I think, for the average panel on AI that I've been used to speaking at, but I find that in addition to job killer as a descriptor of artificial intelligence, I also hear black box to describe it quite often. So in the context of discussions around algorithmic accountability and transparency issues, how AI is making decisions about people, where and when, I think making sure that the public feels like there are outward-facing conversations about corporate accountability, transparency, and corporate governance issues around this is also really important.
Awesome. So we have a few minutes before I'd like to open it up to questions, but that's kind of a good note to switch to any closing thoughts you might have. And the prompt I'd like you to respond to is, this is a developer audience, right? I mean, and this is early days yet, and the decisions you make right now about how you sort of engage AI as a technology are going to be like crucial for the next decade or more. So what's your sort of 1-minute advice to people in the audience, either as developers, interaction designers, project managers? How should they think about how to get into AI?
You got to think about 3 things: the data sets, the algorithms, and the workflow integration. Ideally, when you generate data sets, you don't just have the raw data, but your workflows actually also are captured in a way that you create the label training data automatically. So if, for instance, you use a CRM, service cases come in, and with an incoming email, eventually, once that case is closed, it will also be attached to that case. You'll have also attached, these were the actions that had to be taken. This was the knowledge base article that solved that problem. And this is how long it took. If you collect that data automatically in your workflows, then you can use algorithms to later on predict that. So it's very important for developers to think about having their data sets in one place, then be knowledgeable about what kinds of algorithms would solve what kinds of problems. Are there APIs out there already? Do you have to do some custom development? And then really carefully work with the product teams and UI UX teams on integrating the AI in the right places, in the right workflows, so people feel enhanced.
That is awesome advice. Nicola, what's your advice?
I think, first of all, it's an amazing time to be in technology, right? I think if you think about the history of humankind, I mean, this is we're at the verge of creating like another version of ourselves, right? In the next, it's not going to happen next week, right? But it's going to happen in the next few years. So that's absolutely fantastic. So we all have a role to play in that new step in the evolution, right? But the other thing is that I think data is really important. I think so one of the biggest limitations I think for enterprises to apply AI to real business problems is the availability of data, meaning we need to create data exhausts everywhere. So think about, even if he says, why am I capturing these logs? Why am I capturing this type of information? Just do it, because it might be useful in the future, right? So I think, and the machine will play a very important role, because there are some data that we will never understand as humans, right? We're not built to make correlations across hundreds of variables. That's not our brain, right? So I think having that habit, right, of go there and capture every interaction between the machine and the human, and within the process and in the workflow, is critical. And then the other one is be ambitious, right? This is one of the things that is not going to happen incrementally. It's not going to be one. We're going to make an advancement, a centimeter every day. No, this is going to be like in big leaps. So if you are ambitious and you're going for the sky, right? I think we're gonna discover something interesting in the future.
So think about the data and think about how you integrate it in the workflow and do it ambitiously.
Until someone really invents a system, because it doesn't exist yet, right? That you can train, and maybe, I don't know, that goes back to the whole dichotomy of this space, right? The pragmatism versus, the idealism. But I think until someone invents a way that, a machine can learn with 2 or 3 examples, we're going to still be tied to having a lot of data, right? It's going to be a while until we get out from, deep learning and gigantic sets of data. So it's critical. But the enterprises today don't capture that. They have a very limited set of data. There is an historical reason for that, cost of storage, etc. But now that there isn't, and we have the cloud, this beautiful thing, we should think that way.
Awesome. So Tara, what's your advice?
I won't beat the horse dead on data, I guess, although I also agree it's really important. I think an area that's really ripe for a lot of work in this field in particular is in human-machine interaction. And I think, if I recall correctly, Deloitte did a study this past year of global executives and found that like 85% of them did not think their firms were at all prepared to integrate AI technology with their workforce so that humans and machines could comfortably work side by side and that humans' productivity could be increased by them, which is sort of the whole conversation that we've been having today. So if you really want to drive toward an outcome where you're helping increase returns and your bottom line, making your workforce more happy using this technology, I think really thinking intentionally about what that human-computer interaction looks like, how you can more capably allow humans to leverage this technology, and vice versa, allowing the technology to be more human-friendly itself, I think is really critical. So that's fairly nebulous and high level, but I think that it really needs to be paid attention to.
Awesome. Thank you guys for all that great advice. So now let's go from, like you said, the more big picture, ambiguous and nebulous kinds of advice to all the specific questions I'm sure you guys have. So let's open it up to questions. I think there should be a couple of mics floating around. Raise your hand if you would like to ask a question.
This may not be as specific as you were hoping, but kind of in a policy area, a lot of, well, I can't put a timeline on it, but when it comes to news and information about policy and things like that, a lot of the burden has fallen on individuals, right? With social media and things like that, you mentioned sentiment with social media. Is there a place for AI to assist kind of individuals that's not part of the workforce to kind of better understand the information that's out there, right? There's a huge volume of it. We're supposed to sift through it to know things about policy or how these things are going to impact economics, things like that, right? And you're not going to be an expert in kind of the huge range of disciplines that there are out there. Is there a place for AI to help kind of individual consumers deal with that much higher volume of information out there and to sift through it and consume it, basically to set up a system for me to gauge, what's truth, what's not, right? Just things like that based on the data that's out there in the world.
So there's actually a paper we just published maybe 3 or 4 weeks ago on summarization. So this is something that we're thinking about actively too. We've just made a lot of progress in a new summarization algorithm that combines general deep learning sequence models with intra-attention and reinforcement learning. And it's a really interesting algorithm. And it's the first time I saw an NLP, a natural language processing system, actually generate multiple coherent sentences in a row. Now, it was just this step one. It was trained on news, on a news corpus from the New York Times and CNN Daily Mail. And it can still be more generalized, and probably eventually it has to be personalized for each person. But we are thinking about it. It's probably going to take at least another year or two before those kinds of algorithms would come to actually help you out. In terms of classifying the truth, it's really tricky. Fake news classification, you can kind of have indicators, and you can easily separate opinion from fact. But in the limit, it'll be impossible to say, there's a news article and it says, 5 people were killed in Yemen. It's impossible for an algorithm to just look at the text and classify that statement as true or false. You have to actually be on the ground and look at what happens. But I think there's a lot of help that people will get in sifting through information in the future.
I personally also have high hope that the government implement some of this technology as well, because interpreting policy is really, really challenging for the average consumer of information. And more recently, we've seen experiments happen where we've been trying to put regulatory text, as one example, or bill text from legislation coming off of the Hill in machine-readable format so that people can sift through the data more. It's data in a different form than we're all used to, but it's lingual data, and it has a big impact on the way that people live their lives. So whether firms or individuals, there's a big interest in being able to search that language more easily and interpret it more easily and interact with the text more easily in a public comment sort of context. So if you're interested in a project, that would be a great one to work on.
More questions?
Great question.
Hello. Hey. What does the new technologist look like? So you mentioned AI is a derivation of math and all these basic fundamentals. At what point does the new technologist just start to focus on, calling an API without really knowing all the underlying? So you mentioned that you know the math, maybe we know machine code, we really know the core that made the AI. At what point should we maybe even be concerned that if something breaks down the line or the core of someone's AI technology, breaks way down the line? How do we prepare folks so that they really understand the real basic math and fundamentals behind that technology? So I guess it's like a two-part question. The new technologist and who's going to remember all the stuff that happened to save us in the future, just in case, I guess.
So I think the answer is complicated. I don't think everybody has to understand all the details of all the things all the time, right? Most people who program in JavaScript could not program in assembly. And might not know the registers of a GPU and how exactly GPU, information from CPU RAM is transferred to GPU RAM, and all those hardware details, right? In many ways, the power of developer tools is abstraction, and we're now able to put together very complex mobile and browser-based apps in a very short amount of time. That used to take a very, very long and complex workflow. We have so many useful abstractions. Now, where it becomes tricky is what if the abstractions fail? And you have that in networking too. Nobody needs to know about all the error correcting codes as you send TCP/IP packages around in order to build a web app. But you know that there are error codes that will fix all the issues that happen when certain bits get lost in the network. And so, likewise, I think we'll need to build AI systems in a way that will be fault tolerant. That if the AI makes a mistake, which is again inevitable almost, like if it's 100% accuracy, we probably wouldn't call it AI anymore. It's just like a very basic rule. You need to think about, as you're exposing those AI outputs to users, to educate them. Like, this is a prediction where the algorithm is only 5% certain versus 95% certain. In many cases, AI predictions will fall on a so-called precision and recall trade-off curve, where you might say the first 100 out of 10,000 predictions that I will make are with 99.9% accurate, But then as I make more and more predictions, my precision will fall. And so that it's just important to understand how you evaluate these metrics, and it is important to educate. So we have Trailhead, which is this learning platform. We're trying to gamify, have modules and badges and so on. And I think it's important for developers to keep up to date with AI and read up on these. I'm also teaching at Stanford, and all those materials from my class, CS294, and are public. All the videos are public. All the problem sets are public. So I think there's actually a lot of really great information out there on how to learn more about AI. And I encourage all developers to really go through that material that is out there.
Nicola, did you perhaps want to add something about the institutional answer to that question? Like there's how individuals have, I might forget and who's going to remember. Is there also an answer at the institutional level? How do companies remember all the things that have gone into their AI systems?
I think, I agree with Richard, what he said. I think it's important that first of all, we highlight what are true the capabilities of the algorithm to make decisions. So if you say, it's 80% accurate, 70%, that's really, it's really important to highlight that. Or the fact that it's been made by an algorithm versus a human, it's also an important thing, at least for the enterprise to know. So you don't. But fundamentally, there is one thing, right? So when people say, the AI will take over the world and they're going to kill us or put in a zoo or in a museum or whatever, I think fundamentally we shouldn't forget that we have control. Right, so that has to be almost like the principle number one of designing an AI solution is that never give away the control, right? And that means that you can trust at some point, but the control part is important. So, do you need to go know all the nitty-gritty details about how the technology really works? I think it will be impossible for actually a human, a single person, to know everything around that. There is too much research. The field is too wide. But you need to know what the technology can do, right? And you have to be the one that oversees it, at least for a long period of time.
More questions?
Yeah, is there a good example of a industry solution where an ecosystem has come together to create a global pool of data and create a new intelligence that's helpful for the workflow of that industry? For example, global supply chain, or global go-to-markets. There's really some complex problems where multiple parties are involved. So I'm wondering if there is already some body of work or some genome is already been created that can be leveraged. So would love to hear that.
In sciences, there is a lot, right? So, for example, as part of our AI for Good program, we're working with the medical association, right, to expose data around clinical trials and drugs effects, etc. Right? So that's a very positive effect. You think about cancer, right? So you can know, if you want, everything about it, every single person, of course, anonymized, right? But what happens, and then the adverse effects of drugs and stuff like that. So I think that's a really good example. In more the enterprise world, I think we're just starting to see the beginning of it. So a big area right now is procurement, right? Because it's usually not strategic, right, for companies, so they're more willing to share their procurement data. I think very soon we'll see a lot in the supply chain, and I think logistics will be completely transformed, right? The fact that there will be much more like a Uber model for logistics, right, where you can deliver things and it will be very much like a marketplace working that way, and it will have a positive impact on efficiency, cost, quality of service, et cetera, right?
Can we get a microphone?
One last question.
Yes, I'm quite a bit interested in the human psyche and the societal factors of the topic surrounding AI being more and more integrated into the globe, into the world, in the workforce and internationally. And I'm already seeing quite a big technological gap with, for instance, people who know how to code or don't, or even not knowing some of the basic simplicities of technology. Right? So I would say the speed of this curve that we're going to hit with AI and science and data sciences and cloud, and then those that are still a bit behind, yet are a huge part of the workforce around the world. How do we explain this integration and this bridging or closing the gap of those who are knowledgeable and aware and understanding of technology and not, or not as much?
Yeah, but no, I agree. So give an example, right? So when we were doing two things. So one is that when we were doing implementations of technologies at enterprise, let's say 20 years ago, we were spending 3 months to train the users, right? It was like big drama because, every time, this is a computer, this is how you turn it on, and this is what you do. So now if you look at the training in a big implementation of a computer system for an enterprise, that training went from, 3 months to a day, an afternoon. Why? Because people have been becoming like very much digitally enabled, right? So because everybody has a phone, so I don't need to, if I build a system that is intuitive, and I think Salesforce is a perfect example that it's easy to manage, I don't need to explain, how everything works. So I think that will happen, right? So that integration. But I agree completely on one thing. So there is I think nobody is thinking enough yet about the psychological impacts of having to take orders within the enterprise from a machine, right? There are lots of interesting dilemmas that are originating with some of the clients that we have. I'll give an example. It's a credit, it's a company, it's a bank. So they are doing credit underwriting, right? And so they have developed an algorithm that does it, okay? But they said, but the last word is for the human, right? So the human can say yes or no, right? Can override the algorithm. Okay, this is the problem, right? So if you're the human and you always say yes, what's going to happen to your job, right? People will say, okay, so he's saying yes all the time, so the algorithm is accurate, so I'm not needed anymore. But if I say no all the time, what happens too, right? So there are like huge psychological impact. And also when we think about, for example, workplace safety, there will have to be mental health safety as well to be introduced as one of the new disciplines to consider when you do this type of stuff. And I'm not seeing it, unfortunately, so even if we a little bit talk about it, yet the level of depth of study around it. And it's going to be interesting because if I'm a human, right? I don't want to be taking, the algorithm is good, is accurate, has a lot of data, but, what's my relationship to it, right? So it's really, really tricky problem, I think.
All right. Thanks, Richard, Nicola, Tara. Thanks to all our panelists for a great hour. So unfortunately, we have to stop now, but let's give our panelists
Thank you for the good questions.